Welcome to Bella&Goch. Today we are exploring the corporate machine that swallowed a planet whole. We're talking about Hurston Dynamics, the industrial giant that turned Stanton into a toxic wasteland of production lines and worker dormitories. But to understand how we got here, we need to look past the smokestacks and acid rain. What drives a company to treat human lives as just another resource to be extracted? How did a mining operation from the early 29th century become the poster child for corporate dystopia? And perhaps most importantly, why does the UEE let them get away with it? Let's take a step back and examine the architecture of power, profit, and pollution that defines life on Hurston today. It all started with a charter and a gamble. Back in 2865, when the UEE first opened the Stanton system to corporate settlement, Hurston Dynamics was just another mining consortium with deep pockets and deeper ambitions. They didn't just want to extract resources, they wanted to own the means of production, the housing, the air itself. While other companies negotiated for territory, Hurston moved fast and brutal, securing Stanton before anyone understood the true mineral wealth beneath that toxic crust. They built the first refineries in record time, imported workers by the thousands, and established a vertical monopoly that made them untouchable. So how did they rise so quickly? The answer lies in a simple corporate philosophy: efficiency above all else, humanity be damned. But here's the thing nobody talks about when they admire Hurston's quarterly profits. Behind every metric of industrial efficiency lies a human cost measured in shortened lifespans, respiratory diseases, and generations trapped in company debt. The Lorville worker districts aren't just poor, they are engineered dependency, designed to keep labor compliant and expendable. Security forces don't protect the people, they protect the assets wearing human skin. And when workers organize, when they demand clean air or fair wages, they don't face negotiation, they face replacement. So why do thousands still flock to Hurston every year? Because in a galaxy where opportunity is drying up, even poisoned air looks like a chance to breathe. This is the dark equation of corporate power, and Hurston wrote the textbook. Diseases and chemical burns that never quite heal. By the 26th century, Hurston's medical division stopped counting individual cases and started averaging life expectancy against productivity curves. Workers weren't employees. They were line items categorized as human assets with depreciation schedules. And when an asset became too costly to maintain, they simply rotated in fresh bodies from the overpopulated megacities of Earth. But this isn't just ancient history we're excavating. Those same particulate filters that turned sunsets into toxic orange smears in 2600 are still running today, just retrofitted with slightly better scrubbers. So why does the UEE allow this? Why does the advocacy look the other way when Hurston's security patrols the hab blocks with military-grade hardware? The answer lies in a contract signed centuries ago, back when Stanton was just an empty promise, and Hurston was desperate to claim it. To understand the brutality, we have to go back to 2587, when Hurston Dynamics was teetering on the edge of insolvency. They weren't always the apex predator of Stanton. They were a middling weapons manufacturer drowning in debt from the Messerera military contracts that had dried up overnight. Their salvation came not from innovation, but from legal architecture. When the UEE decided to offload the financial burden of colonizing Stanton, Hurston offered a simple bargain: give us the planet, and we'll fund the infrastructure ourselves. It was privatization on a planetary scale, a precedent that turned sovereign territory into corporate fiefdoms. They imported millions of workers under indentured contracts, built the first refineries with zero environmental oversight, and established the security protocols that treated labor organizers as domestic terrorists. And within 3 generations, they owned not just the means of production, but the air itself. Today, in 2954, Hurston's business model hasn't evolved so much as metastasized. The workers' districts of Lorville still feature the same prefab hab blocks from 3 centuries ago, now stacked 20 stories high and wrapped in rusted scaffolding. The company store still deducts oxygen usage from paychecks, and the mortality rate remains conveniently unreported in UEE census data. But here's what fascinates me. We've normalized it. We call it the cost of doing business or frontier efficiency, as if breathing clean air is a luxury rather than a right. And as other corporations like Drake Interplanetary or even Microtech adopt similar asset management philosophies, we have to ask whether Hurston was an aberration or simply the first draft of humanity's corporate future. Because in the end, they proved that suffering scales just as efficiently as production. Now stacked 20 stories high, forming canyons of rusted steel where the sky is just a rumor between the exhaust stacks. But here's the thing that really defines the Hurston experience: the debt. Every worker arrives thinking they are earning credits, but the company calculates room, board, air, and water at rates that ensure most laborers owe more at the end of each month than when they started. It's a design feature, not a bug. The question isn't why people stay, it's why anyone ever thought they could leave. And that brings us to the mechanism that made all this possible in the first place. The founding charter that Hurston Dynamics negotiated with the early U.E.E., a document that effectively privatized sovereignty itself. To understand how a corporation became a government, we need to go back to 2789, when the Stanton system was just a collection of survey beacons and theoretical mineral charts. The UEE was hemorrhaging money trying to administer frontier systems, so they made a deal. Whoever could develop Stanton profitably could keep the administrative rights. Hurston Dynamics won the bid not because they were the cheapest, but because they were the most brutal. While other corporations proposed ethical mining and sustainable labor practices, Hurston pitched efficiency. They promised to extract maximum value from both the rock and the people, and the UEE, desperate for tax revenue, signed off on the experiment. This wasn't mere privatization. It was the wholesale outsourcing of colonial governance to the highest bidder, setting a precedent that would reshape the entire Stanton system. But the real turning point came in 2814 with the discovery of Hurstonite, a rare isotope cluster embedded in the planet's mantle that became essential for quantum drive shielding. Suddenly, Hurston wasn't just a mining operation. They were a strategic military asset. The UEE couldn't afford to intervene in labor practices anymore because they needed those shipments flowing to the Navy. And that's when the environmental controls came off. The atmosphere processors were repurposed for smelting exhaust. The oceans became chemical sinks, and the concept of environmental remediation vanished from corporate vocabulary. Today, the cancer rates in Workers' District 4 are 30 times the imperial average, and the company response has always been the same. There's a line at the hiring office every morning. No longer just a backwater mining settlement clinging to life in the outer rim. It was the gatekeeper of the quantum age itself. Every ship that wanted to navigate the void without frying its crew needed Hurstonite shielding, and that meant every credit in the expanding empire eventually found its way back to that toxic sphere. The UEE didn't just notice the discovery. They practically handed the governing keys over to whoever could extract it fastest. Corporate charters were drafted in weeks, not years. Infrastructure poured in like floodwater. But here's the thing nobody expected. The Hurston family didn't just want to sell the isotope. They wanted to own the entire vertical chain from extraction to refinement to distribution. And in 2814, that single ambition turned a struggling planet into a corporate fortress. How exactly does one build a dynasty out of dirt and radiation? The Hurston family started by rewriting the very definition of employment. By 2820, Hurston Dynamics had secured exclusive extraction rights that made them effectively the government of Stanton I, operating with a sovereignty that rivaled the UEE itself on their own turf. They did not merely own the mines, they owned the housing, the water recyclers, the atmosphere processors, and eventually the security contracts that maintained their version of peace. Workers were no longer citizens. They were assets, cataloged and optimized for quarterly output. When the original corporate consortium attempted to push back against Hurston family control, they found themselves bought out, leveraged, or simply squeezed out of breathable atmosphere. It was a masterclass in vertical integration, but it came with a price that would not appear on any balance sheets for decades to come. The factory districts today bear the cost written in ochre smog that never clears. Atmosphere processors haven't kept pace with centuries of unregulated refining, not because they lack capacity, but because replacement filters cut into quarterly margins. Workers inhabit stacked hab units, breathing recycled air that tastes like burning copper, owing debts to the company store that grandchildren will inherit before seeing open sky. And here is the part that should trouble the conscience. This is not a failure of the system. It is the system working exactly as designed. Hurston Dynamics created a self-sustaining economic engine where poverty fuels productivity, and productivity fuels expansion across the stars. They proved that slavery becomes unnecessary when contract law and atmospheric control are properly leveraged. That model did not stay on Hurston. It became the template for all of Stanton. But because replacing them would mean admitting liability, and liability requires compensation. And Hurston Dynamics doesn't admit fault. It accounts for it on spreadsheets and buries it in quarterly reports. To understand why, we need to rewind to 2430, when Wallace Hurston first registered the company as a modest lithium extraction outfit on Earth. Back then, it was just another mining venture with aggressive investors and cheap labor contracts. But Wallace had a vision that extended far beyond terrestrial ore deposits. He saw the early expansion into the stars not as exploration, but as extraction waiting to happen. When the UEE began offering colonial charters in the 25th century, Hurston was first in line with the capital and the ruthlessness to make it work. That early appetite for risk at any cost became the genetic code of everything that followed. By the time the Stanton system opened for corporate settlement in 2865, Hurston Dynamics had already perfected the art of vertical integration. They didn't just mine resources, they manufactured the equipment, transported the goods, and employed the security forces that kept everything moving. So when the UEE decided to privatize Stanton's planets, Hurston wasn't bidding against competitors. They were bidding against their own subsidiaries. The acquisition of Hurston Planet itself wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was the culmination of 2 centuries of learning how to extract maximum value from minimum investment. Overnight, the company transitioned from a resource extraction firm to a sovereign landlord, complete with private law enforcement and company script that replaced standard credits for worker wages. This was the moment the corporation became something the UEE never quite anticipated, a nation-state with a board of directors. So what does that actually look like for the people living beneath those ochre clouds? It looks like 12-hour shifts in refining facilities where the air filters are optional upgrades. It looks like contracts that bind workers to company housing, company stores, and company debt in cycles that span generations. The advocacy calls it economic freedom of contract, but on Hurston, freedom is just another word for no alternative. When workers organize, they don't face union busters. They face corporate security with military-grade hardware and legal immunity. The dark side of Hurston's rise isn't hidden in some secret archive. It's visible in every lung-scarred miner and every child born with elevated toxin levels. And here's the thing nobody talks about. The UEE knows. They've always known. They just decided that cheap antimatter precursors were worth more than the lives spent producing them. Children breathing air that registers toxic on every scanner, while their parents sign liability waivers, acknowledging that atmospheric protection is their own financial responsibility, not the company's. This isn't a bug in the system that can be patched with better regulations. It's the entire operating system, hard-coded from day one. But how did we get here? How did a single corporate entity gain sovereignty over an entire planet, rewriting the very definition of citizenship into a subscription service? To answer that, we need to rewind to 2865, when Solomon Hurston first registered the Articles of Incorporation, not as a standard mining business, but as a colonial expedition with a profit motive and a private army. He didn't just want to extract minerals from the planet. He wanted to own the concept of work itself, and the air you breathe while doing it. The early years weren't just about resource extraction. They were about social experimentation on an industrial scale. Solomon Hurston pioneered what corporate historians now call the closed-loop economy, where the company's store isn't just a convenience for workers. It's the only game in town, setting prices and wages in a perfect vacuum of competition. By 2890, Hurston Dynamics had leveraged its strategic position in the Stanton system to negotiate something unprecedented in UEE history: full corporate sovereignty. They didn't just lease the land from the empire, they purchased the exclusive right to govern it, to write their own legal codes, to field their own security forces equipped with military-grade hardware. And here's the truly disturbing genius of it. They convinced the UEE that this was efficiency in action. Why burden the Navy with colonial administration when a motivated corporation could handle the paperwork, maintain order, and turn a tax profit for the empire all at the same time? So now we return to those ochre clouds, but we see them with the understanding of how they got there. This isn't corporate mismanagement or a tragedy of oversight. This is the end game of a philosophy that treats human beings as depreciation assets with a measurable shelf life. When Hurston Dynamics reports record quarterly profits to its shareholders, those abstract numbers represent concrete lives shortened by preventable respiratory disease, debts that legally transfer to children upon a parent's death, and a security apparatus that doesn't bother investigating disappearances in the underground worker districts. The dark side isn't hidden in encrypted servers or secret meetings. It's displayed proudly in earnings calls, dressed up as operational efficiency and cost per employee optimization. And here's the truly terrifying part: it's replicable. Hurston didn't just build a factory on a polluted world. They built a template that Arc Corp and Microtech are already following across the system, just with better marketing and slightly cleaner air. And that philosophy has a name, or rather, it had one back when Hurston Dynamics was just a mining outfit on Earth, long before the Stanton system was even a blip on corporate radars. Wallace Hurston didn't build an empire by caring about atmospheres. He built it by treating human life as a depreciating asset and environmental regulations as costly inefficiencies. When the UEE offered the Stanton Charter to 4 corporations willing to develop the system privately, Hurston wasn't interested in building a society. He saw a blank canvas for pure extraction, a place where the old rules about breathable air and 40-hour workweeks could be left at the jump point. So the question isn't how they polluted an entire planet. It's how they convinced generations of workers that the ochre skies were simply the color of opportunity. The rise wasn't subtle, and it wasn't accidental. By 2865, Hurston had leveraged that Stanton Charter into something the UEE couldn't afford to dismantle: a vertically integrated supply chain that fed the military machine during the darkest years of the Vandal War. When the Messer era collapsed and the new government needed cheap ordnance fast, Hurston Dynamics was already running smelters that never cooled, employing populations that never saw natural sunlight. They didn't just win contracts, they became critical infrastructure. And here's the thing about corporate sovereignty that nobody discusses at Terra dinner parties. Once a company writes its own laws on a planet it owns, that creates a feudal state with better marketing. The advocacy could investigate worker deaths, technically, but only if they could afford to land ships in air that eats hull plating. Which brings us to the dark side, the part that doesn't make it into the quarterly earnings reports. In the worker districts of Lorville, the end game of that philosophy breathes through respirators. Hurston doesn't have citizens, it has employees, and employees are renewable resources. The company stores deduct oxygen and housing from wages that never quite cover the debt, creating a closed economic loop that legal scholars call indentured servitude and Hurston calls competitive retention. When workers organize, they don't face police. They face corporate security who don't need warrants, only quotas. And the ochre clouds, they're not a byproduct anymore. They're a message, a visible reminder that on Hurston, the only thing that matters is the quarterly yield, and the atmosphere is just another overhead cost to be minimized. Hurston Dynamics calculates atmospheric toxicity not as a liability, but as a secondary revenue stream. Every breath drawn in the worker districts carries the metallic tang of unfiltered industrial particulate, a byproduct of the very manufacturing that keeps credits flowing upward. See, when we examine this corporation's rise to dominance in the Stanton system, we rarely look at the human depreciation, filed under operational costs on their balance sheets. Workers aren't employees here. They're consumables with serial numbers, housed in cramped habstacks that overlook the very refineries poisoning their lungs. And the company knows exactly what they're doing. Why invest in atmospheric scrubbers for the poor when respirator contracts generate recurring revenue? It's vertical integration of suffering, wrapped in quarterly projections that Wally's Hurston himself would have recognized immediately. The same ruthlessness that built the dynasty now maintains it through institutionalized indifference. But maintaining this ecosystem requires more than just environmental neglect. It demands active enforcement. Enter Hurston Security, the iron fist-wearing corporate insignia. These aren't peacekeepers. They're asset protection specialists whose primary mandate is safeguarding company property. And under Hurston law, that property includes the people breathing that toxic air. When workers organize, when they demand basic atmospheric standards or living wages, they aren't seen as strikers. They're classified as inventory malfunctions requiring correction. And here's where the history gets particularly dark. The same security infrastructure originally built to protect Hurston's early colonial investments from Vandal raiders evolved seamlessly into domestic suppression tools. Why let a crisis go to waste? The surveillance networks, the armed patrols, the detention facilities in the outskirts of Lorville, all repurposed to ensure the assembly lines never stop, regardless of how many bodies it takes to keep them running. So when historians ask how a single family maintained control over an entire planet for centuries, the answer isn't found in quarterly dividends or mining contracts. It's in the normalization of expendability, the slow acceptance that some human lives are simply worth less than percentage points of growth. And this is the template that other Stanton megacorps studied carefully. ArcCorp saw the efficiency. Microtech noted the control mechanisms. Crusader understood the branding necessary to mask the brutality. Hurston didn't just build a company. They prototyped a model of corporate sovereignty that would define the entire system. The respirators wheeze on, the habstacks crowd higher, and somewhere in an executive tower, another spreadsheet calculates the exact cost of a human life against the price of clean air. That calculation is Hurston's true legacy, and it echoes through every corner of the empire they helped create. It's in the normalization of expendability. The idea that a human being is simply capital equipment with a depreciation schedule, a resource to be extracted like the minerals beneath the crust. Hurston Dynamics didn't just pioneer this philosophy. They codified it into corporate law long before they ever secured the Stanton Charter. When other companies were still negotiating with unions and offering retirement packages, Hurston was already calculating the exact cost per hour of a worker's lifespan against the efficiency gains of zero safety protocols. And here's the uncomfortable truth. It worked. It worked so well that by the time the UEE was looking for someone to industrialize Stanton Roman 4, Hurston was the only bidder that could promise the profit margins the government wanted. But building an empire on disposable lives requires ensuring nobody asks where the bodies go. The rise of Hurston Dynamics isn't a story of innovation or technological breakthrough. It's a story of arithmetic. While ArcCorp was busy terraforming and Crusader was dreaming up cloud cities, Hurston was perfecting the art of the balance sheet, specifically the line item that read workforce replenishment. By treating employee mortality as an operational cost rather than a tragedy, they could undercut every competitor in the sector. This efficiency attracted the U.E.'s attention during the expansion into Stanton. The government needed someone to turn Stanton Roman 4 into a manufacturing powerhouse, and they needed it done fast and cheap. Hurston promised both. They secured the planet lease in 2865, and within decades, the surface transformed from pristine wilderness to a network of antimatter refineries and weapon foundries. But this rapid ascent came with a price that wouldn't appear on the corporate ledgers for generations. Which brings us to the dark side, the part of the corporate history that the recruitment brochures leave out. Today, Hurston's atmosphere is a cocktail of industrial pollutants that reduces life expectancy to 50 standard years, and that's only if the accidents don't claim them first. The Lorville workers' districts are graveyards of aspiration, where generations are born into debt and die before they can pay it off. But the true horror isn't the pollution or the poverty. It's the replication of the model. ArcCorp saw Hurston's profits and adopted the disposable workforce philosophy. Microtech streamlined it. Even Crusader, for all its utopian marketing, contracts security through shell companies that use Hurston-style liability waivers. So when we look at Stanton today, we're not looking at four separate corporate experiments. We're looking at one perfect system of human extraction, refined over centuries, and painted in four different colors. Reduces life expectancy by nearly 30% compared to Terra standards. And here's the thing that makes this truly insidious. This isn't some legacy of ancient industrial accidents that the company is struggling to clean up. This is by design. Hurston Dynamics operates under a blanket exemption from every environmental protection statute that the UEE ever wrote, all thanks to a corporate charter signed centuries ago that treats the entire planet as private property. When your air filtration system fails in the worker barracks, you don't call a safety inspector because there isn't one. You file a maintenance ticket with the same corporation that decided breathable atmosphere was cutting into the quarterly profits. So how did we get here? How did a single company gain the right to poison an entire world and call it efficiency? To understand that, we need to go back to the early days of the Stanton system's colonization, when Hurston was just another mining prospect with a particularly ruthless business plan. The answer lies in a legal framework that classifies human beings as employee assets under corporate property law. When Hurston Dynamics secured their planetary charter in 2865, they didn't just buy the land and the minerals. They bought the right to govern the people living on it. Workers don't earn wages in the traditional sense. They receive company scrip that can only be spent in company stores, creating a closed economic loop where debt is inherited and freedom is theoretical. Try to quit, and you'll find that your exit fees for housing, oxygen, and transportation exceed any savings you might have accumulated. But here's what nobody talks about. This system was so profitable that it became the template. ArcCorp, Microtech, Crusader Industries, they all studied the Hurston model and adapted it for their own domains. So why does the UEE allow this? Why does the government of Terra look the other way while millions suffocate under corporate rule? Because in the grand calculus of empire, Hurston Dynamics delivers something the UEE desperately needs: stability without expense. By outsourcing governance to corporate entities, the empire extends its reach into the frontier without draining the central treasury or risking political capital on backwater systems. Hurston provides the antimatter, the weapons-grade metals, and the processed goods that fuel the Navy's expansion. And in return, the advocacy looks the other way when labor inspectors mysteriously fail to visit. It's a devil's bargain that has persisted for nearly a century, and it has made Hurston one of the most powerful entities in human space. But as we watch the pollution storms roll across Lorville, we have to ask ourselves, what price are we paying for this convenience? And more importantly, how long can this system hold before the workers decide they've breathed enough ash? Its reach without draining the Navy's coffers or testing the Senate's patience. And Hurston, they saw opportunity where others saw only risk. Back in 2865, when Solomon Hurston first chartered the company, Stanton was little more than a resource assessment on a bureaucrat's desk. The UEE needed antimatter precursors, heavy metals, and a manufacturing base that didn't ask questions about environmental protocols or labor standards. Hurston Dynamics offered all three, wrapped in a promise of self-sufficiency that sounded like music to cash-strapped administrators drowning in post-Messer reconstruction debt. But here's the thing nobody talks about. This wasn't exploitation of a loophole. It was the design. The UEE didn't accidentally create corporate fiefdoms. They architected them deliberately, trading sovereignty for efficiency in a deal that would reshape human expansion forever. The next 3 decades unfolded like a case study in aggressive vertical integration. By 2890, Hurston had transformed Stanton's fourth planet from a barren rock into a smoke-choked industrial powerhouse, complete with orbital refineries and a private security force that answered to board members instead of admirals. They weren't just mining anymore. They were manufacturing munitions, processing fuel, and building the very ships that would eventually patrol their own shipping lanes. And this is where things get interesting. While other corporations struggled with UEE oversight, Hurston embraced the bureaucracy, embedding compliance officers so deeply into company structure that the line between corporate policy and imperial law blurred beyond recognition. They didn't resist the empire. They became indistinguishable from it, creating a template that ArcCorp and Microtech would follow decades later with their own variations. But power consolidated rarely remains clean, and Hurston's meteoric rise came with a cost measured in lung tissue, shortened lifespans, and generations of debt-bound servitude. The pollution that turned Hurston's skies a permanent burnt orange wasn't an industrial accident or a temporary inconvenience. It was profitability made visible, the externalities of cheap production dumped onto workers who had nowhere else to go in a system designed to trap them. Take a walk through Lorville's worker districts today, and the story writes itself in the scarred faces of heavy industry laborers who owe their souls to company stores and company housing. So why did they choose this approach? Because it worked. While Terra debates ethics committees and Crusader builds floating gardens, Hurston perfected the art of expendable humanity, proving that in the outer reaches of empire, suffering is just another resource to be extracted, refined, and conveniently forgotten. The pollution that turned Hurston's skies from deep blue to permanent rust didn't happen overnight, and that is perhaps the most chilling part of the story. It was the result of decades of calculated decisions, of antimatter refineries, and heavy manufacturing complexes that treated the planetary atmosphere as an open sewer for industrial waste. By the 27th century, Hurston Roman IV had become a textbook example of corporate excess unchecked, where acid rain corroded ship hulls within weeks and respiratory diseases became the leading cause of death among the permanent workforce. And yet, Hurston Dynamics consistently framed this environmental devastation as necessary sacrifice, as the unavoidable cost of humanity's expansion among the stars. But here is what the corporate archives do not show. They could have installed proper filtration systems at every facility. They could have deployed atmospheric processors decades before regulations finally forced their hand. They chose not to, because dead workers are cheaper than clean air, and quarterly earnings reports do not account for generational trauma. So how exactly did Hurston Dynamics keep their factories staffed when the very air was toxic and the soil contaminated with heavy metals? The answer lies in the indentured servitude contracts that Hurston's legal team perfected decades before other corporations dared to implement similar systems. They recruited aggressively from desperate outer colonies, from failing settlements on the edge of bankruptcy, offering passage and basic housing in exchange for labor contracts that typically spanned 20 to 30 years. These were not employees in any meaningful sense. They were assets, tracked by serial numbers rather than names, housed in sealed company dormitories, and paid in company scrip that could only be spent at company stores. And when a worker inevitably developed respiratory illness from the toxins saturating the environment, the company medical plan simply added the treatment costs to their existing debt. It was a closed loop of exploitation so elegant in its cruelty that it became the template for industrial labor practices across the entire Stanton system. Today, walking through the industrial sectors of Lorville, one can still see the legacy of those early decisions written in the stained concrete and the filtered breathing masks worn as fashion statements by the workforce. Hurston Dynamics has modernized their rhetoric, of course, talking about corporate citizenship and workforce optimization, but the fundamental relationship remains unchanged. The planet is still dying, the workers are still disposable, and the profits still flow upward to shareholders who have never set foot on Stanton Roman IV. And this is the part we need to understand about corporate history. It does not end. These systems do not self-correct. They only evolve, becoming more efficient at extraction, more sophisticated in their PR, but never actually healing the wounds they inflict. Hurston did not rise despite the suffering. It rose because of it, and that mechanism is still running at full capacity today. But to understand why those masks became necessary in the first place, we need to rewind nearly 2 centuries to when Solomon Hurston first set foot on this dusty rock. Back then, Stanton Roman IV wasn't a poisoned factory world. It was an opportunity wrapped in iron oxide and unrealized potential that the UEE was desperate to exploit. Solomon didn't see a planet. He saw an engine waiting for ignition, a machine that could be optimized. And in 2865, when the UEE granted him the original corporate charter, it seemed like a perfect marriage of convenience. The empire needed warships desperately, and Hurston Dynamics promised to deliver them faster and cheaper than any lumbering government yard ever could. What nobody anticipated, however, was how completely one family would come to own not just the means of production, but the very atmosphere their workers depended upon for survival. The rise wasn't gradual. It was gravitational and utterly relentless. By 2890, Hurston Dynamics had vertically integrated every stage of production from raw ore extraction to quantum drive installation, creating a closed economic loop where money flowed perpetually inward and chemical waste flowed outward into the soil. They built Lorville not as a city for people, but as housing for human resources, a distinction that becomes chillingly clear when you examine the early employment contracts signed under duress. Workers weren't hired. They were acquired with debts for transport, housing, and even the breathable air that piped into their cramped hab modules. When competitors complained about unfair practices, the UEE looked the other way because Hurston was meeting military quotas during the Messer era's deepening paranoia. And so the corporation grew from manufacturer to monarch, rewriting the very definition of what it meant to be a citizen in Stanton. And here is where the history becomes uncomfortable. The dark side of Hurston isn't hidden in secret archives. It's measured in respiratory illness rates and the chemical burns that still scar the northern hemisphere. When workers tried to organize in 2912, the company didn't negotiate. They vented the atmosphere from entire hab blocks and called it a maintenance error. By the time the advocacy investigated, the evidence had been recycled into foundation concrete. This is the unspoken contract that Stanton Roman 4 operates on today. Efficiency above biology, profit above people. The breathing masks aren't fashion statements or historical quirks. They're admissions of systemic failure written on the faces of every citizen. And as Hurston Dynamics continues to post record profits quarter after quarter, those stained concrete walls remain the only memorial to those who paid the price for the empire's armaments. They're incontinence to this day. When we examine Hurston Dynamics, we must recognize that the atmospheric toxicity isn't merely a byproduct of industry. In many ways, it was the business model itself. The corporation discovered early on that environmental remediation costs far exceeded the projected healthcare burden of a disposable workforce, so they simply stopped pretending to care. Workers breathe the same heavy metals they mine, returning to dormitories where the air is barely cleaner than the factory floor, and every breath of filtered oxygen comes with a docking fee from wages already below subsistence levels. Hurston security isn't there to protect citizens. It exists to protect assets, which includes the machinery and the barely human laborers operating it. But here's the question that haunts corporate historians. How did this become normalized? How did a manufacturing firm transform into a planetary government with the power to write its own laws? To understand the architecture of modern oppression, we need to rewind to 2865, when the original Stanton System Charter was drafted in boardrooms that smelled of cigar smoke and compromised ideals. Hurston wasn't always a planet-sized factory. Once, it was merely an ambitious aerospace firm with excellent political connections. The family leveraged their munitions contracts during the late Messer era into serious political capital, positioning themselves as essential to UEE border security and economic stability. When the government needed to offload the staggering financial burden of colonizing Stanton, Hurston Dynamics was the only bidder with enough liquid capital and sufficient ruthlessness to make the projected numbers actually work. They didn't just purchase land rights, they acquired jurisdiction itself. Suddenly, labor laws became internal policy rather than federal mandate. Environmental standards transformed into optional line items, and the advocacy found itself needing corporate permission to conduct investigations. This wasn't a corruption of the corporate model. It was its inevitable logical conclusion. But the truly tragic irony lies in the company's genesis. Back when Hurston Dynamics was merely a precision machining cooperative on Earth, founded by Solomon Hurston with a genuine vision of affordable spacecraft for the working class. The original manifesto spoke passionately of democratizing the stars, of breaking the government monopolies on space travel that kept ordinary people grounded and poor. Solomon couldn't have imagined that 3 centuries later, his descendants would operate anti-union death squads, or that his name would be synonymous with respiratory failure in children living downwind from refinery complexes. The transformation from idealistic startup to planetary despot didn't happen overnight. It required generational ambition, each boardroom meeting pushing the ethical boundary slightly further until the original humanity was completely engineered out of the corporate structure. And that, perhaps, is the darkest lesson of all. That the worst tyrannies don't start with monsters, but with accountants who simply found it cheaper to let people die than to install atmospheric scrubbers. La precision manufacturing for the working class. Solomon Hurston genuinely believed that quality tools shouldn't be luxury items reserved for the elite, that a machinist in Jakarta deserved access to the same calipers as an aerospace engineer in Berlin. But here's the thing about noble intentions when they meet frontier capitalism. They rarely survive the gravity well of expansion. When the cooperative secured its first military subcontract in 2432, the board faced an existential choice between Solomon's communal profit-sharing model and the staggering revenue promised by defense contracts. They chose the latter, naturally, and by 2450, the Hurston family had been quietly bought out by venture consortiums. The name remained, polished and preserved like a museum piece, while the original philosophy got buried beneath quarterly earnings reports and shareholder meetings. So when we examine the darkness at the heart of Hurston Dynamics, we must remember that it wasn't born a monster. It was carefully taught to become one. By the time the UEE announced the Stanton colonization initiative in 2865, Hurston Dynamics had transformed from a modest tool manufacturer into a vertically integrated military-industrial powerhouse with interests in 3 systems. They didn't merely bid for the Hurston Planet contract. They architected the entire proposal around total resource extraction, promising the UEE a self-sustaining industrial fortress that would require 0 federal subsidies after initial seeding. And here's where the transition becomes complete. Where Solomon once fought for worker ownership and dignity, the new corporate structure treated human labor as a depreciating asset, interchangeable and ultimately expendable. The first arcologies rose not as communities, but as containment facilities, filtering toxic particulates from the aggressive strip mining operations below. Stanton's second planet became a monument to efficiency at any cost, with every cubic meter of atmosphere commodified, and every citizen converted into a production unit measured in output per breath. The transformation was absolute, irreversible, and terrifyingly profitable. Today, from the observation decks of Lorville, one can trace the complete erasure of Solomon's dream in the smog-choked horizon, stretching endlessly toward the strip mines. The worker housing districts, euphemistically termed employee accommodation zones, represent the final evolution of corporate feudalism, where debt binds tighter than physical chains and breathable air is treated as a payroll deduction. But the truly insidious genius lies in the branding. Hurston still manufactures precision instruments, still claims that heritage of craftsmanship, even as it operates the most brutal labor extraction system in the UEE. The same company that once advocated for worker dignity now counts productivity metrics in shortened lifespans and accumulated medical debt. And as the massive reclaimers haul derelict hulls into the scrapyards below, we see the metaphor made literal. Everything becomes raw material eventually, including history itself, fed into the furnaces to keep the quarterly dividends flowing. The worker housing district extends beneath those observation decks like a cancerous growth of prefabricated misery, each habstack packed with souls who will never see the profits their labor generates. But here's the thing nobody talks about when they discuss Hurston's efficiency. This wasn't an accident of rapid industrialization or a temporary measure during the expansion boom. This was engineered. Solomon Hurston's successors looked at the original colonial vision of sustainable communities and actively chose this instead. They calculated that it was cheaper to replace exhausted workers than to house them humanely, cheaper to import fresh labor from debtor colonies than to raise children in clean air. And so the district became a machine for consumption. Human bodies fed into the refineries, replaced monthly, buried in unmarked trenches when the toxins finally overwhelmed the med pens. Why maintain what can simply be replaced? To understand how we reached this point, we need to step back to the corporate restructuring of 2808, when the Hurston family formally dissolved the last remnants of colonial governance and rebranded their operation as Hurston Dynamics. This wasn't merely a name change. It was a declaration that the planet itself was now a product, and every living thing upon it merely a resource to be optimized. The new board implemented what they called aggressive asset utilization protocols, which sounds like corporate jargon until one realizes it legalized the 12-hour shift, the company script system, and the private security forces that answer only to quarterly earnings reports. But here's where it gets interesting. They didn't just exploit the law, they wrote it. When the UEE finally expanded into Stanton, Hurston Dynamics had already established precedents so entrenched that the empire simply codified them rather than dismantle the infrastructure. Why fix what was already profitable? And this is the legacy that defines modern Hurston, a planet where the atmospheric processors struggle against centuries of cumulative pollution, where the advocacy maintains only a token presence in the executive towers, while the real law is enforced by security contractors with assault rifles and debt collection quotas. But the truly disturbing part isn't what is visible from those observation decks. It's what remains hidden. The company archives hold termination records numbering in the millions, each entry representing a life deemed insufficiently productive, a cost center eliminated with the same dispassion used to decommission obsolete machinery. Yet Hurston Dynamics remains the model that Arc Corp and Microtech study with envy, the benchmark for extractive efficiency in human space. So one must ask, when ships are fueled with Hurston-processed quantum fuel, when armor is forged in their smelters, is the wider civilization complicit in a system that treats people as disposable components? The smog-choked horizon doesn't offer answers. It merely waits for the next shift change. In Lorville's upper districts, while the real power flows through Hurston Security's black and gray checkpoints. This isn't an accident of neglect. It's the culmination of a century-long transfer of authority that began when the UEE first chartered Stanton to private interests in 2865. You see, Hurston didn't just inherit a planet. They purchased the sovereign right to govern it, to police it, to judge it, and ultimately to bury their mistakes in the ever-expanding scrapyards. So why does a weapons manufacturer need its own army? The answer lies in the early 2800s, when shareholder value became the only metric that mattered, and corporate security evolved from rent-a-cops into a private military with orbital strike capability. But here's the thing nobody talks about. This model was so profitable that it became the template for the entire Stanton system. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to the 28th century, when Hurston Dynamics was still a mid-tier arms supplier struggling to compete with the military-industrial giants of Earth. They weren't special. They made rifles, they made margins, they made cuts, and they were drowning in red tape. So what changed? In 2808, the company made a pivot that would redefine corporate history. They stopped merely selling weapons and started selling asterisk security asterisk, complete planetary security as a managed service. The UEE was hemorrhaging money trying to administer distant colonies, and Hurston offered a simple solution: give us the charter, and we'll handle the infrastructure, the policing, and the paperwork. It was a devil's bargain that turned a manufacturing firm into a sovereign government, and the Stanton system became the proof of concept for the modern corporate state. And this is where the history books get sanitized, because the rise of Hurston Dynamics isn't just a business success story. It's a study in how to monetize human suffering at industrial scale. By 2900, The workforce had ceased to be employees and become assets, complete with depreciation schedules, salvage value calculations, and disposal protocols. The atmospheric processors weren't built to clean the air. They were built to keep the smog just breathable enough that workers could survive another shift before the toxins caught up. So when we talk about the dark side of this corporate empire, we're not talking about a few bad decisions. We're talking about a system where pollution is profitability, where a worker's life is cheaper than the suit they wear, and where the legacy of that 2808 charter is written in the brown haze that hangs over every habdome from Lorville to the outer mines. By 2900, Hurston Dynamics had perfected a system so efficient that productivity metrics became indistinguishable from mortality rates. They stopped calling them workers and started calling them human assets, complete with depreciation schedules and salvage value calculations. When someone died from chemical exposure in the antimatter refineries, the cost wasn't measured in grief. It was a line item, a replacement fee, a training overhead for the next disposable body. And here's the truly disturbing part. It was completely legal. The UEE's corporate charters allowed planetary governors to set their own labor standards, and Hurston's legal team had spent decades ensuring those standards were written in their favor. So the air grew thicker, the shifts grew longer, and the cemeteries grew larger, all while the quarterly earnings reports climbed higher. But this level of exploitation doesn't go unnoticed forever. So what happened when the advocacy finally looked away from the vandal front long enough to notice the body counts? Nothing, at least not at first. Hurston had become too big to fail, too integrated into the UEE's military supply chain to be regulated. But the cracks started showing when whistleblowers leaked the asset reclamation protocols, documents detailing how the company would retrieve valuable implants from deceased workers before informing families. Suddenly, the sanitized history couldn't hold. Protest movements emerged in the worker districts. Sabotage became an occupational hazard for executives, and Hurston had to pivot. They didn't reform, they rebranded. Safety theater replaced actual safety, corporate housing became debt traps, and the suffering moved underground, quite literally, into the subterranean manufacturing levels where satellites couldn't see. Today, in 2954, Hurston stands as a monument to what happens when corporate power calcifies into governance. In the worker districts of Lorville, the metal still tastes acrid in the air, while amber warning lights from the antimatter facilities pulse like a heartbeat in the smog. The company doesn't need chains anymore because debt works better, and they don't need whip-cracking overseers when algorithmic monitoring tracks every bathroom break and conversation. But here's the lesson that echoes across the Stanton system. Arc Corp, Crusader, Microtech, they all watched and learned. They saw that human beings could be pushed to the brink of extinction, labeled as efficiency, and written off as tax-deductible infrastructure costs. Hurston's history shouldn't be viewed as a cautionary tale, but rather as a blueprint, because in the UEE, the only thing that changed was how well they hide the bodies. While amber warning lights cut through the smog, unchanged for centuries. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the early 2900s, when Hurston Dynamics wasn't a planetary government, but merely a struggling mining outfit looking for its big break. The Stanton system had just been opened for corporate settlement, and Hurston saw something nobody else did in that toxic atmosphere: opportunity. They weren't the first to arrive, and they certainly weren't the largest, but they possessed something far more valuable than capital: patience. While ArcCorp was pouring concrete and Microtech was drafting blueprints, Hurston was buying land rights, cheap and in bulk, betting that industrial necessity would eventually outpace environmental concern. They acquired toxic wastelands that surveyors called worthless, knowing that once the empire's hunger for raw materials grew desperate enough, location wouldn't matter, only output. It was a gamble that would redefine the meaning of corporate sovereignty. So how did a mining company become a planetary authority? The answer lies in a contract signed in 2913 that most history books barely mention. Facing bankruptcy from infrastructure costs, the UEE made Hurston an offer that would haunt labor advocates for generations: full administrative control in exchange for guaranteeing resource quotas to the military. Hurston didn't just accept, They weaponized the opportunity. Within a decade, they had dissolved local worker councils, privatized the courts, and reclassified employees as corporate assets under perpetual contract. The transition was surgical, almost invisible to the outside eye. One day they were offering competitive wages and housing. The next, they were issuing currency, policing districts, and determining who breathed filtered air. By the time the advocacy realized they'd created a corporate nation-state, the paperwork was already filed, the walls were built, and the workers were already inside. But here's the thing nobody talks about when they discuss Hurston's efficiency metrics. Those impressive production numbers come with a human cost that's measured in shortened lifespans and chronic respiratory diseases that the company officially doesn't track. In the worker districts below Lorville's central tower, generations live and die without ever seeing the sky, their lungs filtering the same metallic particulates their grandparents inhaled. The company's stores don't sell medicine that works. They sell debt that chains. And when someone finally collapses on the assembly line, they're not mourned as a person, but logged as depreciated equipment. Hurston didn't just build an industrial empire. They perfected a system where human suffering is the invisible infrastructure, and the real product being manufactured is inevitability. It's a machine that runs on people, and in 2954, the fuel tank is still full. Spiratory conditions that the company quietly categorizes as acceptable attrition. And that is the term that needs to be held in mind, acceptable attrition. Because when Hurston Dynamics established its first atmospheric refining platforms in the early 28th century, they were not merely constructing industrial infrastructure. They were prototyping a labor model that treated human beings as biodegradable machine parts. The chemical processors that keep the fusion furnaces burning require compounds that no human respiratory system was designed to filter, let alone survive long-term exposure to. Workers sign liability waivers acknowledging these hazards, or so the corporate literature claims. But informed consent means something different when one is fleeing crushing debt from the UEE core worlds with nowhere else to turn. So how exactly did civilization arrive at this point? How did a single corporate entity gain the authority to determine who lives, who dies, and what precisely constitutes an acceptable loss? To understand the monster, one must examine the era that created it. The 27th and 28th centuries were defined by desperate expansion. The Messer era had collapsed. The UEE was hemorrhaging resources, and they needed raw materials faster than bureaucratic governance could deliver them. Enter the Corporate Sovereignty Act of 2734, legislation that essentially stated, if a corporation could hold a planet, it could own a planet. Hurston saw opportunity where others saw only risk. They promised the UEE something irresistible, self-sufficient industrial output without the administrative overhead of colonial governance. In exchange for exclusive mineral rights, Hurston would handle its own security, its own labor disputes, its own environmental regulations. It was privatization taken to its logical extreme, and for a century that simply wanted cheap antimatter precursors without asking questions, it was the perfect arrangement. But the question remains, perfect for whom exactly? Today, Hurston stands as a monument to what happens when efficiency becomes theology. The planet's rust-colored atmosphere is not merely pollution. It is the physical manifestation of a philosophy that measures success only in output tons per hour. Examine the worker habitats scattered across the industrial wastes, prefabricated coffins where the average lifespan barely cracks 50 standard years. Yet here is what makes this truly insidious. It is completely legal. The UEE. Courts have ruled repeatedly that corporate sovereignty extends to internal labor policy. As long as Hurston meets its tithe to the empire, as long as the antimatter keeps flowing, the advocacy looks away. And so the machine grinds on, consuming generations of desperate souls who trade decades of their lives for a ticket to a world that promised opportunity. In the Stanton system, they do not simply mine minerals. They mine human potential until the vein runs dry.